Recently, there has been announcements of a highly virulent strain of HIV in Europe, and we've seen health experts such as Prince Harry advising us to all get tested. But what on earth are they talking about? The Yin and Yang of HIV was published by the Perth Group's Dr. Valinda Turner and investigative journalist Andrew McIntyre in 1999. 2 decades later, the paper remains as relevant as when it was written. The paper was produced in 3 parts, and in this video I'm presenting part 1. Supporters of the HIV causes AIDS hypothesis cannot back up their claims with scientific evidence, yet they continue to reject alternative explanations and promote life-threatening drug treatments. A theory is a good theory if it satisfies 2 requirements. It must accurately describe a large class of observations on the basis of a model that contains only a few arbitrary elements, and it must make definite predictions about the results of future observations. Dr. Stephen Hawking. The notion that HIV/AIDS is infectious and sexually transmitted is based on a relationship between antibodies claimed specifically induced by a retrovirus HIV and particular diseases in certain risk groups. However, the HIV theory has been challenged for well over a decade in many scientific publications, principally by Peter Duesberg from the USA and Eleni Papadopoulos and her colleagues in Perth, Western Australia. Failure of HIV/AIDS to spread beyond the original risk groups, and particularly to Western heterosexuals, especially non-drug using prostitutes, signals that the HIV theory of AIDS is in need of urgent reappraisal. This has serious implications for both the way science has been conducted and for public health policy and planning. The HIV theory has cost billions of dollars and locked in enormous amounts of energy and research by thousands of scientists worldwide. So far, it has yet to save a single life. There is an urgent need to establish a truly independent and distinguished international committee to review the current theories and those that challenge them. There needs to be a cooperative but urgent reassessment of AIDS. A Nobel laureate stirs the waters. In 1988, Dr. Kary Mullis, the 1993 Nobel Prize winner for chemistry, was employed by the US National Institutes for Health to set up analyses for HIV testing. When preparing his report, he asked a virologist colleague for a reference that HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. He was told he did not need one. Mullis was surprised. I disagreed. It was totally remarkable to me that the individual who had discovered the cause of a deadly and as yet uncured disease would not be continually referenced in the scientific papers until that disease was cured and forgotten. There had to be a published paper, or perhaps several of them, which taken together indicated that HIV was the probable cause of AIDS.
So the first line of that was HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. I wrote that, and then I said, well, I need a paper, some kind of scientific paper, to reference that statement, because when you make a statement like that, that's like a fact. So you need to say, here's how come I know that.
Otherwise, as Mullis was forced to conclude, the entire campaign against a disease increasingly regarded as the 20th century Black Death was based on a hypothesis whose origins no one could recall. That defied both scientific and common sense. A decade later, Mullis was to write, I finally understood why I was having so much trouble finding the references that linked HIV to AIDS. There weren't any.
Here's how come we know that HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. There was nothing out there like that. Nothing.
Indeed, an interested non-specialist observer armed with a few contacts and a good library merely has to scratch the surface to realise that the HIV theory of AIDS begs many more questions than it answers. The beginnings of AIDS. The few years leading up to the AIDS era and the discovery of HIV are illuminating. It was a time when a promiscuous minority of young, liberated gay men in a few large American cities were increasingly developing previously uncommon diseases such as fatal forms of the malignancy Kaposi sarcoma and of fungal pneumonia known as PCP.
The debate about the role of promiscuity in defining urban gay maleness has been changed utterly and forever, because now gay men are dying. Gay men like you and me.
At the time, whilst it was reasonable to implicate an infectious microbe transmitted by rampant, indiscriminate sexual practices interspersed with needle sharing and drug taking, the fact that immune suppression had multiple causes was also known in 1981. Some considered the diseases resulted from multiple assaults to bodily functions caused by the many and varied diseases, toxins and treatments that accompanied the gay and drug-taking lifestyle that had evolved during the late 1970s. Just how extensive these multiple assaults were was indicated by the English journalist Neville Hodgkinson, documenting the range of infections of just one homosexual, the late Michael Callan, in his book AIDS, The Failure of Contemporary Science, How a Virus That Never Was Deceived the World. Hodgkinson writes, from 1973, when he came out as a homosexual, to 1975, he only got mononucleosis and nonspecific urethritis. In 1975, he had his first bout of gonorrhea, but from there it all began to snowball. First came hepatitis A in 1976, then more NSU and gonorrhea, in 1977 amoebas and hepatitis B, NSU and gonorrhea, 1978 more amoebas, my first case of Shigella, and more VD, then in 1979 hepatitis A, third time, non-A, non-B, amoebas, giardias, a fissure, and my first case of syphilis. And of course, more gonorrhea. In 1980, the usual gonorrhea, Shigella twice, and more amoebas. Added to that list were herpes simplex types 1 and 2, venereal warts, salmonella, chlamydia, cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr virus, mononucleosis, and finally, cryptosporidiosis. Indeed, an early US CDC study confirmed that the first 100 men with AIDS had a median lifetime number of 1,120 sexual partners. As Callan himself put it, by 1981 I got some combination of venereal diseases each and every time I had sex.
Promiscuity is a vague word which means different things to different people. But until we develop a better vocabulary, promiscuity remains the best word we have to describe the historically unique phenomenon of large numbers of urban gay men who have large numbers of different sexual partners in such commercialized settings as bathhouses, back rooms, bookstores, balconies, meat racks, and tea rooms.
Not surprisingly, given the widespread belief of a causal relationship between immunity and the maintenance of health, in 1981 the new disease became known as gay-related immune deficiency, GRID.
The National Center for Disease Control is reporting more cases of two rare and deadly diseases found in homosexual men. There is no apparent explanation for the outbreak.
Obviously, this is an issue with great emotional fervor, but...
How can we stay unemotional when people are dying every day from a disease the CDC has yet to name? For crying out loud, if the CDC won't name it, at least demand the press stop calling it GRID.
Well, unfortunately, I have to take credit for coining the term GRID, which stood for gay-related immune deficiency. We were seeing a cluster of gay men who were suddenly critically ill of pneumocystis pneumonia, which was the indicator disease of something new, and reported our findings to the CDC.
In fact, none of the diseases were new. Some were known to occur in drug addicts and haemophiliacs long before the AIDS era. What was new was the exponentially escalating prevalence in gay men. Technology and virology. Coincidental with the beginning of the AIDS era, a technique was developed to classify and count the different types of lymphocyte white blood cells. It was noticed that some AIDS patients had diminished numbers of the so-called T4 helper cell subtype, and despite lack of proof, the cells were assumed to be dying at the behest of an agent selectively targeting them. This became the hallmark of AIDS as well, forming a measure of the amount of immune deficiency. In turn, this immune deficiency, the AID in AIDS, caused the diseases, the S in AIDS, that constitute the clinical syndrome. The perceptions that T4 cells were dying and AIDS was infectious led to the theory that AIDS is caused by a microbial organism.
AIDS is not a disease, right? AIDS is a whole lot of different things. Depends on what country you're in.
5 years prior to the AIDS era, a few laboratories around the world were drawing towards the end of a fruitless search to prove a viral cause for human cancers. During the 1970s, Dr. Robert Gallo, the central figure as co-discoverer of the AIDS virus, and his colleagues claimed to have discovered 3 human retroviruses. In 1975, the first human retrovirus, HL23V, was proposed to cause human leukemia, but by 1980 was considered an embarrassing mistake, in fact not to have ever existed. Of the remaining 2, one was postulated to cause a specific, though rare form of adult leukemia, and the second remains orphaned without a disease. What is significant is that the latter 2 retroviruses are said to exhibit a liking for T4 lymphocytes. This led Donald Francis Gallo and others to propose that an existing or closely related retrovirus was the agent responsible for killing the T4 cells in AIDS patients. When researchers actively sought and then discovered the same diseases in individuals who were not gay, retroviruses as well as retrovirologists received renewed interest and GRID became AIDS. First proclamations. In May 1983, Professor Luc Montagnier and his colleagues at the Pasteur Institute in Paris published a paper in Science entitled Isolation of a T lymphotropic retrovirus from a patient at risk for acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. It is important to note that the first word in this paper, isolation, serves as a signal that the researchers are claiming proof for the existence of a new virus.
I really was excited because we knew it was a new type of virus, not shown before in men, and very likely to be the cause of AIDS. Of course, at that time we didn't have the full proof it was the cause of AIDS.
In the interests of science, on several occasions, Montagnier sent samples of his tissue cultures to the Gallo laboratory in America, with the express understanding that these could be used for biomedical, biological, and molecular biological studies. However, Montagnier did not claim to have proven his virus was the cause of AIDS, and the French discovery lay on the table until May 1984, when Gallo and Popovic and their colleagues published 4 papers also in Science. On the 23rd of April 1984, at a Washington press conference held 2 weeks before the papers were published, Margaret Heckler, Secretary for Health and Human Services, announced that Gallo and his co-workers had discovered the probable cause of AIDS and had developed a sensitive blood test to detect the virus in the body.
First, the probable cause of AIDS has been found. Thirdly, with discovery of both the virus and this new process, we now have a blood test for AIDS. With the blood test, we can identify AIDS victims with essentially 100% certainty.
A curative vaccine was predicted within 2 years. Inexplicably, causation was proclaimed merely by association, and despite isolation of HIV in only 36% of Gallo's 72 AIDS patients, barely a third, the frequency of isolation is no better today. In 1985, the Pasteur Institute alleged that Gallo had misappropriated their virus. The ensuing conflict, which eventually reached the US courts, was settled by a negotiated agreement signed in 1987 by Gallo and Montagnier as co-discoverers, and US President Reagan and French Premier Chirac. Nevertheless, the matter drew the attention of John Crewston, an investigative journalist, and US Senator John Dingell. In November 1989, Crewston published a lengthy article in the Chicago Tribune newspaper, which provoked an internal NIH inquiry into suspect data from Gallo's laboratory. A draft report of the formal investigation, written by the NIH Office of Scientific Integrity, was published in September 1991, in which the principal author, Mikolas Popovic, was accused of misconduct for misstatements and inaccuracies that appeared in the first science paper, and suggesting that Gallo, as laboratory chief, created and fostered conditions that give rise to falsified, fabricated data and falsified reports. The OSI's final draft report, completed in January 1992, was immediately criticised and was followed by a review of the OSI report by the Office of Research Integrity, which found Gallo guilty of scientific misconduct. Nonetheless, even after this long investigation and its conclusion, the US government withdrew its findings following Gallo's announcement of an appeal. Despite this, in 1994, US officials credited Montagnier and his colleagues as the discoverers of HIV and yielded the French a greater share of royalties from the HIV antibody tests. In taking these unprecedented steps, Dr. Harold Varmus, the director of the NIH, acknowledged that scientists at the NIH used a virus provided to them by Institut Pasteur to invent the American test kit. This action scarcely vindicated the Dingle report, which had concluded that the settlement barely managed to paper over the glaring, unresolved issues. Rather, it was the culmination of a cover-up, where political and international reputational imperatives at HHS assumed preeminence over scientific integrity, while defending Gallo's claim became tantamount to defending the US government itself. According to Eliopoulos and her colleagues, regardless of the material uncovered by the OSI, Gallo's data, which still remains the best of its kind, does not prove the existence of HIV, and even if it did, nowhere in the papers is there proof that HIV causes AIDS. Enter Peter Duesberg. In December 1987, 3.5 years after the Washington press conference, Professor Peter Duesberg, virologist and molecular biologist at the University of California, Berkeley, published an invited paper entitled Retroviruses as Pathogens, Expectations and Reality. Duesberg was a much feted scientist, considered to be the golden boy of virology and the greatest living retrovirologist. He had developed many of the laboratory techniques for studying retroviruses and their genetic makeup, had discovered cancer-causing genes, and was recipient of a $350,000 Outstanding Investigator Award from the NIH. But Duesberg dropped a bombshell. He asserted that apart from the relatively few cancer-causing retroviruses, the majority are virtually harmless.
I concluded that retroviruses play a negligible role in cancer in general, and based on the evidence available to me at the time, no role in AIDS.
Duesberg argued that HIV is neutralized by antibodies shortly after infection, and thus antibodies signal its containment. He also pointed to data proving that well, sick or dying from AIDS, HIV-positive individuals contain insufficient amounts of HIV to do harm. Even if HIV were to kill all the T4 cells it had infected every 1 to 2 days, the number of T4 cells needing replacement approximated the amount of blood shed by a man cutting himself shaving. For the protagonists, the low viral burden, that is the amount of HIV DNA in cells, was a fact that no one, not even Gallo, could satisfactorily reconcile with an immunity-destroying pathogen killing gay men within a year or two of diagnosis. However, rather than addressing this as a scientific problem warranting dialogue with someone known to have considerable knowledge of the subject, Duesberg's questions antagonized Gallo to the point where he refused to discuss the matter.
He was a very respected virologist at one time and went off on this, I think, probably anti-Gallo thing, which is easy to do because Bob Gallo's a difficult person and Peter was a good scientist, and Bob being a very bright scientist, but it was in some ways just as crazy as Peter, but in his own self-serving way. But Peter just went off the deep end scientifically.
Meetings convened to deal with the uncomfortable implications of Duesberg's paper were suddenly cancelled at the highest level. In 1989, Duesberg presented further argument. HIV does not fulfill the postulates that 19th century bacteriologist Robert Koch had developed to prove a microbe causes a disease. These 4 postulates are: A, the organism must be present in all cases of the disease. B, it must be grown and then isolated in pure culture from the cells of individuals with the disease. C, it must reproduce the disease when introduced into a susceptible host or experimental animals. D, from where it must once again be recovered.
I don't see that HIV proves the first and certainly not the third of Koch's postulates, which is the most critical one, that when injected or infected you get the disease.
According to Duesberg, from every angle HIV fails Koch's first postulate. The second postulate was fulfilled, but only by subjecting cells to drastic chemical manipulation that did not approach conditions in vivo. The third postulate failed because, as Duisberg points out, during the past decade, more than 400,000 AIDS patients have been treated and investigated by a system of 5 million medical workers and AIDS researchers, none of whom has been vaccinated against HIV. But 10 years later, there is not even one case in the scientific literature of a health worker who ever contracted presumably infectious AIDS from a patient. AIDS is not infectious. Similarly, 9 years after the NIH first started infecting chimpanzees with HIV, over 150 so far at a cost of $40,000 to $50,000 apiece, all are still healthy. In 1992, Duisberg shifted focus from HIV to argue that AIDS is acquired by drug consumption and other non-contagious risk factors. Apart from illicit and recreational drugs, Duisberg's list included the first antiretroviral drug, zidovudine, AZT. In other words, a specific treatment for HIV infection was postulated to be a cause of AIDS. Duisberg continued to regard HIV as bona fide, but as an inert, harmless passenger virus linked to AIDS only through the kinds of activity associated with drug taking, including taking of prescribed drugs. Duisberg, like others before him, pointed to the epidemiological data revealing a 50-fold difference in the AIDS attack rate between various groups of HIV-positive individuals, as well as the proclivity of certain AIDS diseases for particular risk groups. Thus, 50% of HIV-positive blood transfusion recipients develop AIDS within 1 year, but so do 50% of HIV negatives, compared to 1% of haemophiliacs. Kaposi sarcoma was, for all intents and purposes, confined to gay men. Thus, even if HIV were necessary to cause AIDS, it could not be the only factor. It was possible to argue that HIV may be only a minor factor, or at least in the minds of Eliopoulos and Duisberg, not a factor. Apparently the role of HIV was also a problem for Montagnier. Although he wrote in Nature in December 1984 that all available data are consistent with the virus being the causative agent of AIDS, in 1985 he expressed an opinion impossible to reconcile with the HIV theory. This syndrome occurs in a minority of infected persons who generally have in common a past of antigenic stimulation and of immune depression before HIV infection. That is, cause after effect. One must surmise that within a year the discoverer of HIV was already hedging his bets. His recent interview with the investigative journalist Jamal Tahi fuels such speculation. Eliopoulos and the Perth Group.
We do not say that HIV doesn't exist. What we say is that the presently available data does not prove the existence of HIV.
The biggest problem with the HIV theory of AIDS is HIV.
Eleni Papadopoulos Eliopoulos' AIDS research began in 1981. In May 1986, she submitted for publication a paper which refuted every step in the HIV theory, including HIV itself. She also proposed an alternative non-viral theory of which Duisberg's drugs AIDS hypothesis is a subset, and predicated non-toxic and relatively inexpensive treatments. Her theory was based on a general theory of cellular functioning, which she had formulated in the 1970s as a basis for unravelling the genesis and improving the treatment of cancer, and to offer fresh insights into the pathogenesis of cardiovascular diseases and aging. Eliopoulos postulates that normal cellular functioning is determined by the level and oscillations of cellular redox, oxidation, and its chemical opposite, reduction. In her view, when oxidation is prolonged or excessive, cells become abnormal, injured, and susceptible to diseases. Eliopoulos had noticed a link between the risk groups. Gay men, drug users, and haemophiliacs are exposed to chemical stressors in the form of semen, nitrites, illicit drugs, and factor VIII, the blood-clotting protein missing from and administered to haemophiliacs. There is abundant evidence that these substances are potent cellular oxidants. In Eliopoulos' view, oxidative stress produces low numbers of T4 cells and AIDS, as well as the phenomena inferred as proof for the existence of HIV. The ready acceptance of the Montagnier-Gallo 1983-1984 science papers posed enormous difficulties for Aleopoulos in having her work published. Thus, reappraisal of AIDS is the oxidation caused by the risk factors the primary cause, was twice rejected by Nature, eventually finding light of day in medical hypotheses 12 months after Duisberg. However, the editor of this journal had also rejected the paper, only recanting after Aleopoulos worked for several months to convince him that equatorial Africa was not in the grip of an epidemic of sexually transmitted immunodeficiency, and thus not in breach of her theory.
Whole nations have been led to believe that, in some instances, that they've got large percentages of their population infected and doomed because of this supposed sexually transmitted virus. It's such a tragedy.
To paraphrase the theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking, wrong predictions affirm bad theories. Correct predictions make them powerful. The HIV theory requires that HIV causes all the AIDS-defining diseases and predicts that HIV/AIDS will become a global epidemic via the oldest and most unstoppable of all human activities. However, Kaposi sarcoma, one of the two diseases for which the HIV theory was proposed, is no longer attributed either directly or indirectly via AID to HIV. In the OECD countries, the prediction of a sexual pandemic has failed completely. For example, as of the beginning of 1998, 93% of the cumulative deaths from AIDS in Australia occurred in the original risk groups, that is, gay, bisexual men, drug addicts, and haemophiliacs. This observation fits the classic demographic profile of non-infectious diseases, such as pellagra, beriberi, and scurvy, which characteristically remain confined to their risk groups. All are caused by vitamin deficiencies, but in the past were regarded as infectious, and sufferers were shunned and quarantined. The HIV protagonists also predicted a curative vaccine by the end of 1986, and an animal model to prove the HIV theory beyond all doubt. Neither prediction has been fulfilled. A vaccine is not envisaged until well into the next century, possibly around 2010, and animals given HIV do not develop AIDS. On the other hand, the Aleopoulos oxidative stress theory predicts the current demographic data, an apparent loss of T4 cells, the risk from passive anal intercourse in both sexes, HIV positive and AIDS patients being oxidized relative to normal individuals, the amelioration of HIV/AIDS by the use of antioxidants, and a non-infectious animal model. Every one of those predictions has materialized. Oxidative stress is well established by hundreds of papers, so much so that in the early 1990s, the Pasteur Institute was advertising international scholarships for study into the phenomenon. In fact, last year, Luc Montagnier became the principal editor of a 558-page book devoted to oxidative stress in cancer, aging, and AIDS. The Aleopoulos theory predicts that a decline in T4 cells can occur without cellular death. In fact, according to the Perth group, there is no evidence to support the notion that T4 cells are dead or that HIV kills such cells. In T4 cell cultures, the same number of T4 cells disappear, regardless of whether one adds HIV or merely the chemical stimulants obligatory to grow the HIV. Neither is there proof that low numbers of T4 cells are either necessary or sufficient to produce a clinical syndrome. This is a view recently expressed by leading HIV/AIDS scientists such as Dr. Arthur Anderson from the US Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease and Dr. Zvi Grossman at the University of Tel Aviv. In other words, the central tenet of the HIV theory, virus-induced killing of immune cells leading to AIDS, is now being questioned by HIV/AIDS experts themselves. Nonetheless, and despite so much evidence to the contrary, the orthodox view remains entrenched. In fact, since 1993, the low number of T4 cells has been enshrined in the 1993 CDC AIDS definition, whereby AIDS can be diagnosed without a disease. Just as cofactors were proposed to rescue the HIV theory in the mid-1980s, In July 1998, Chen and colleagues from the UCLA AIDS Institute, School of Medicine, Los Angeles, reported evidence that naturally non-infectious virus or virus rendered defective by anti-HIV drugs could still contribute to the loss of T4 cells throughout the course of HIV disease. In other words, alive or dead, HIV causes immune deficiency. Such a proposal does not augur well for the use or continued development of anti-HIV drugs. Consistent also with the Aleopoulos oxidative stress theory, mice repeatedly injected with foreign cellular proteins develop a dramatic depletion of T4 cells in Kaposi sarcoma-like tumours, and abundant retrovirus-like particles appear in their spleens. Thus, AIDS diseases are followed by the production of retrovirus-like particles, and not the other way around. To the uninitiated, this may seem perplexing, but it is well recognised that retroviral particles appear de novo in cell cultures, not previously infected, because all cells contain retroviral information carried in the germline DNA. Indeed, according to distinguished retrovirologists such as Weiss and Temin, new retroviral DNA arises by rearrangement of cellular DNA caused by many factors, including pathological processes, a view that concedes retroviruses as an effect and not the cause of diseases. The rise and fall of anti-HIV drugs. It would take a second article to discuss AZT and the many other anti-HIV drugs. Suffice it to say, there is no scientific proof that such drugs kill HIV or cure AIDS, but there is ample evidence they are harmful. In 1994, a double-blind randomized comparison of two policies of AZT treatment, immediate and deferred, was reported, the Concord trial. This involved 1,749 symptom-free HIV-infected individuals from centres in the UK, Ireland and France. The 347 clinical endpoints, AIDS and death, outnumbered the total of those in all other published trials in symptom-free and early symptomatic infection. The results showed there was no statistically significant difference in clinical outcome between the two therapeutic policies. In 1995, extended results of Concord showed a significant increased risk of death among the patients treated early. However, despite these data, despite disclaimers that patients treated with AZT may continue to develop the AIDS diseases, that the side effects of AZT may mimic AIDS, and that AZT given to non-HIV infected babies causes the AIDS-defining pneumonia, PCP, AZT continues to be the most commonly prescribed anti-HIV drug. Dr. Donald Abrams, Professor of Medicine and Director of the AIDS Program at San Francisco General Hospital, said, "I have a large population of people who have chosen not to take any antiretrovirals. I've been following them since the very beginning. They've watched all of their friends go on the antiviral bandwagon and die."
I have patients tested in 1985. They were all advised to take treatment, but they declined the treatment for different reasons. Because they didn't want to take toxic drugs because they were feeling well at that time.
And how are they doing today?
They are still living.
Healthy?
Yeah.
Indeed, even an elementary study of the pharmacological literature reveals that AZT cannot be an anti-HIV drug. It is toxic to all cells. In fact, what unites long-term survivors of AIDS is their resolve not to take antiretrovirals. In mid-1996, the latest drugs, the protease inhibitors, were introduced. These are prescribed as one of up to 250 possible combinations of cocktails with AZT or similar drugs as highly active antiretroviral therapy. Detailed data on these drugs, of the kind usually reserved for medical practitioners, appear regularly in glossy multi-page advertisements in gay men's magazines.
In 1996, David Ho announced highly active antiretroviral therapy.
At the July 1996 11th International AIDS Conference, Time magazine Man of the Year, David Ho, predicted that scientists would find new drugs to wipe HIV out of the body within 3 years, possibly within just one. At the July 1998 12th AIDS Conference, Ho stated it would take at least 10 years of intense combination drug therapy to kill off all the HIV in an infected person's body, but that a sizable percentage of HIV patients will never get close. Many patients cannot tolerate the untoward effects of these cocktails, and measurements show that the DNA viral burden does not decrease significantly. According to Kaufman et al., 49% of people taking HAART, who were followed by the Swiss HIV cohort study, did not have viral suppression, and similar data are emerging from other centres. In the May 1998 proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. William Poole, former director of the National Institutes of Health Office of AIDS Research, wrote, "No matter how long a person is treated with anti-HIV drugs, there will always be new viruses. You will have to be treated forever. No one is getting cured. This bodes extremely poorly for combination therapy as something curative." Dr. Michael Sagg at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, USA, is responsible for the treatment of over 1,000 AIDS patients. His treatment is state-of-the-art, and his clinic is sought after by pharmaceutical companies to conduct trials on their newest compounds. In a recent interview, Dr. Sagg said, "Perhaps the biggest difference between the cure paradigm and whatever paradigm we're in now is we now should expect failure with whatever HAART cocktails we first use. We should plan on it. We should prepare for it. Clinicians should expect failure." Sagg warns the HAART dam is already leaking and there's high danger of it collapsing altogether. Failures are occurring right and left. Speaking about his dying patients, they aren't dying of traditionally defined AIDS illness. I don't know what they're dying of, but they are dying. They're just wasting and dying. It is sobering. While we are making good guesses, they are just guesses. We don't know what we are doing. Given the toxicity of these drugs, it is unlikely anyone can tolerate taking them for more than a few years. If this outlook is gloomy for HIV/AIDS sufferers, it is even worse considering there is no substantial alternative therapeutic strategy anywhere on the horizon.
The treatment causes a very similar condition we would expect from an AIDS patient. That's why nobody noticed that there was something wrong with the treatment. That's the very reason why everybody believed HIV is a deadly virus, because the HIV-positive patient at that time got a deadly treatment.
The futility of all anti-HIV drugs, past, present and future, is best highlighted in a June 1998 interview by Dr. Harold Varmus, Nobel laureate retrovirologist and director of the National Institutes of Health. Trying to rid the body of a virus whose genome is incorporated into the host genome may be impossible. The demise of scientific democracy.
AIDS is the best example of what's really scary and alarming and dangerous about our culture right now, which is that it's a culture of PR. It's a public relations phenomenon. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is the image.
The longevity of the HIV theory has been considerably boosted by the virtual refusal of editors of leading medical journals to publish any material which takes HIV to task. Without these data and the stamp of approval engendered by such publication, it is almost impossible for the debate to reach the ears of those who matter the most, clinicians and their patients. Like generals directing wars, the remoteness of editors begets an objectivity which, while essential to clear thinking, militates against an appreciation of the profound responsibilities editors hold at the bedside. Ultimately, although the HIV theory is manifoldly problematic, physicians, patients, relatives, politicians, journalists and the tax-paying public are systematically denied knowledge of its existence and substance. Not only is there a total absence anywhere of a disinterested, adjudicated debate, but individuals whose only motivation is to contribute to solving a disease claimed to afflict millions of people find themselves censored. For example, Sir John Maddox, former editor of the world's most prestigious science journal Nature, denied Duisberg the right of reply on issues he raised because his views give many infected people the belief that HIV infection is not in itself the calamity it is likely to prove. Yet in a recent edition of the same journal, but in another context, there is a claim that the voice of skeptics may grow tiresome, but the mainstream is in trouble if it cannot win a public debate with them. Officials at the Berlin 10th International AIDS Conference confiscated Dutch AIDS analyst Robert Lahoven's press pass and threatened him with expulsion from Germany for criminal trespass because he placed copies of the dissident journal Rethinking AIDS on an unauthorized table. Nature has repeatedly rejected every paper and letter submitted by Aliopoulos and her colleagues since 1986 without providing a single scientific reason, and invariably citing space constraints in their journal. Not even the profound implications of the Tahi Montagnier interview are of any apparent concern to Nature. Professor John Kaldor, one of Australia's foremost established experts on AIDS, admits that dissidents intersperse their cases with grains of fact. However, because of Kaldor and colleagues' strong instinct not to dignify the skeptics' arguments by attempting to refute them, arguments based on these grains of fact and many other data remain unanswered and unresolved. The Yin and Yang of HIV by Dr. Valinda Turner and Andrew McIntyre, Part 2. When put to the test, conventional HIV/AIDS theory is at odds with the clinical evidence. Is purified HIV no more than a tangle of cellular debris?
That's when I first started saying, they don't know. Nobody really knows. This whole thing is a big sham.
The real purpose of the scientific method is to make sure nature hasn't misled you into thinking something you don't actually know. One logical slip and an entire scientific edifice comes tumbling down. One false deduction about the machine and you can get hung up indefinitely. Robert Pirsig, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Some scientific problems with the HIV theory. The theory versus the definition. The central premise of the HIV theory of AIDS is that there exists a unique retrovirus transmissible via blood and sexual secretions, which induces specific antibodies and kills T4 cells, whose relative absence then causes the appearance of approximately 30 diseases, which constitute the clinical syndrome. The theory, however, is rendered completely contradictory by the official AIDS definition used clinically. In Australia, an individual is diagnosed as having AIDS if he or she fulfills the criteria set out in the latest 1993 revision of the US CDC surveillance case definition for AIDS. Other definitions in use around the world make scientific comparisons almost impossible. In Africa, AIDS is diagnosed on symptoms and without blood tests. Since from 1985, the Centers for Disease Control accepts HIV as the cause of AIDS, it should not be possible to diagnose AIDS by any means inconsistent with the HIV theory. However, even a cursory reading of the 1993 definition reveals AIDS can be diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, which even Gallo accepts is not caused by HIV in the absence of immune deficiency, without laboratory evidence of HIV infection, and extraordinarily, in the presence of negative results for HIV infection. Sexual transmission.
If I were to have unprotected sex with somebody who is HIV positive, how many acts would I have to engage in before I got the virus?
Just one. I assume one would be enough.
First act?
One is enough.
HIV/AIDS is claimed to be bidirectionally sexually transmitted. Data to support this claim are based not upon microbial isolation and contact tracing, as is the orthodox practice for proving diseases are infectious and sexually transmitted, but on mostly retrospective studies of highly selected groups of individuals, including homosexual and bisexual men, heterosexual men, and women, including prostitutes, for antibodies in blood which react with certain proteins deemed HIV specific. Included in these studies are estimations of risk factors for the specific sexual practices of penile, insertive, vaginal, anal receptive and oral receptive intercourse. Homosexual men.
So the gay community wanted this to be taken seriously. So they were very pleased when a virus theory was put forward, because it seemed as if that would be a way to democratize this illness.
In 1984, Gallo and his colleagues showed that of 8 different sexual acts, a positive HIV antibody test correlated only with receptive anal intercourse. They also found that the more often a homosexual man had insertive anal intercourse, the less likely he was to become HIV positive. this is incompatible with an infectious cause. In 1986, Gallo and his colleagues reported they found no evidence that other forms of sexual activity contribute to the risk of HIV seroconversion in homosexual men. In an extensive review of 25 studies of homosexual men reported in 1994 by Caceres and Van Griensven, the authors concluded that no consistent risk of the acquisition of HIV-1 infection has been reported regarding insertive intercourse. In the West, the largest and most judiciously conducted prospective epidemiological studies, such as the multi-centre AIDS cohort study, MAC study, of 4,954 gay men, have proven beyond all reasonable doubt that in homosexual men, the only significant sexual act related to becoming HIV antibody positive is receptive anal intercourse. Thus, in gay men, AIDS may be likened to the non-infectious condition pregnancy. It is acquired by the passive partner, but is not transmitted to the active partner.
In the MAX study, they have shown the only sexual act directly related to the development of the phenomenon which is called HIV and of AIDS was passive anal intercourse.
Significantly, the MAC study also showed that once a homosexual man becomes HIV positive, progression to AIDS is further determined by the amount of passive anal intercourse sustained after infection. This is contrary to all that is known about infectious diseases. Infection, not repeated infections, cause disease. Indeed, the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons considers HIV-positive surgeons to be, quote, infectious, and that they should not perform invasive procedures or operations, but they may provide these services to patients who have the same infection. Heterosexuals. The largest and best conducted studies in heterosexuals, including the European Study Group, showed that for women, the only sexual practice leading to an increased risk of becoming HIV antibody positive is anal intercourse. The unidirectional transmission of HIV observed in OECD countries is supported by Nancy Padian's 10-year study of heterosexual couples from 1986 to 1996. There were two parts to the study. One cross-sectional, the other prospective.
HIV, then we recruited their sexual partners and we looked at whether transmission in fact had occurred.
In the cross-sectional study, the constant per contact infectivity for male to female transmission was estimated to be 0.0009. The risk factors for the women were 1. Anal intercourse, 2. Having partners who acquired this infection through drug use. Padian says this means the woman may also be IV drug users. 3. The presence of STDs. Of the HIV-negative male partners of 82 HIV-positive female cases, only 2 became HIV positive, but under circumstances that Padian considered ambiguous. In the prospective study, starting in 1990, 175 HIV discordant couples were followed for approximately 282 couple years. At entry to the study, 1/3 used condoms consistently, and in the 6 months prior to their last follow-up visit, 26% of couples consistently failed to use condoms. There were no seroconversions after entry, including the 47 couples not using condoms consistently.
Padian runs a study. It's a 10-year study with the world's most virulent, terrifying sexually... this thing jumps, off of penises into vaginas miles away. How many of them do you think, after 10 years, with the world's most terrifying, virulent, sexually transmitted disease came up positive? Nobody.
Based on the 286 men who became HIV positive in the early study, the risk to a non-infected male from his HIV positive female partner was reported to be in the order of 1 in 9,000 per contact. From this statistic, one can calculate that on average, a male would need to have 6,000 sexual contacts with an infected female to achieve a 50% chance of becoming HIV positive. If sexual intercourse were to commence at age 20 and average 3 times weekly, this would occupy a lifetime. Female prostitutes.
It's got to be heterosexually transmitted. There's no proof that it's transmitted at all at that point. So why not just say, well, it's heterosexually transmitted too? Because that made it a plague, and the CDC needed one. The CDC hadn't had a good plague since polio.
The notion that HIV is a virus which does not discriminate is also markedly inconsistent with the data obtained from studies of female prostitutes. Even if by some unknown means a sexually transmitted infectious agent found its way into the promiscuous portion of the gay male population in certain large cities in the United States in the late 1970s, as is widely accepted, and given the facts that prostitutes are frequented by bisexual men and that at the very earliest safe sexual practices date from 1985, one would have expected HIV/AIDS to have spread rapidly through prostitutes and thence to the general community. However, the prevalence of, quote, HIV antibodies amongst prostitutes is almost entirely confined to those who are drug users. Virtually all other prostitutes have not been and are not becoming HIV positive. In September 1985, 56 non-intravenous drug-using prostitutes were tested in the Rue Saint-Denis, the most notorious street in Paris for prostitution. More than 1,000 prostitutes work in this area. These women, aged 18 to 60, have sexual intercourse 15 to 25 times daily and do not routinely use protection. None was positive. In Copenhagen, 101 non-intravenous drug-using prostitutes, a quarter of whom suspected that up to 1/5 of their clients were homosexual or bisexual, were tested during August to October in 1985. The median numbers of sexual encounters per week was 20. None was positive. In 1985, 132 prostitutes and 55 non-prostitutes who attended a Sydney STD clinic were tested for HIV antibodies. The average number of sexual partners, clients and lovers in the previous month was 24.5. When an estimate was made to separate clients and lovers, the median number of sexual contacts per year rose from 175 to 450. The partners of only 14 prostitutes, 11%, used condoms at all, and 49% of their partners used condoms in fewer than 20% of encounters. No women were HIV positive. The same Australian clinic repeatedly tested an additional 491 prostitutes who attended between 1986 and 1988. Of 231 out of the 491 prostitutes surveyed, 19% had bisexual non-paying partners and 21% had partners who injected drugs. 69% always used condoms for vaginal intercourse with paying clients, but they were rarely used with non-paying partners. Condoms were rarely used by those clients and or partners for the 18% of prostitutes practicing anal intercourse. No women were HIV positive. At the time of this report, a decade into the AIDS era, the authors commented that there has been no documented case of a female prostitute in Australia becoming infected with HIV through sexual intercourse. Yet these investigators from the Sydney Sexual Health Centre concluded that there are still many women working as prostitutes in Sydney who remain seriously at risk of HIV infection.
The heterosexual epidemic certainly hasn't seemed to materialise in Australia. For example, in 1991, 10 years after AIDS commenced, researchers were able to write that no Australian prostitutes had been infected through sexual intercourse. None.
In Spain, of 519 non-intravenous drug-using prostitutes tested between May 1989 and December 1990, only 12, 2.3%, had a positive test, which was only slightly higher than that reported 5 years ago in similar surveys. Some prostitutes had as many as 600 partners a month, and the development of a positive antibody test was directly related to the practice of anal intercourse. The authors also noted that a more striking and disappointing finding was the low proportion of prostitutes who use condoms at all times, despite the several mass media AIDS prevention campaigns that had been carried out in Spain. Similar data from 2 Scottish studies, the 1993 European Working Group on HIV infection in female prostitute study and a 1994 report on 53,903 prostitutes working in the Philippines and tested between 1985 to 1992 confirm that non-intravenous drug-using prostitutes remain virtually devoid of HIV infection. For example, in the latter study, only 72 women were found to be HIV positive. In studies where there appears to be a high incidence of HIV amongst prostitutes, there are uncertainties that defy explanation. For example, although HIV has been present in the commercial sex work networks in the Philippines and Indonesia for almost as long as it has been in Thailand and Cambodia, the prevalence of HIV in the former is 0.13% and 0.02% respectively, and 18.8% and 40% in the latter. If these are accurate data, the discrepancy defies epidemiological explanation and has indeed baffled the experts, although the latter postulate behavioural factors such as one's country's prostitutes and clients being considerably more or less sexually active than another. However, one could also pose another question. What are the quote HIV antibody tests actually measuring? Be that as it may, since 44% and 34% of the Cambodian quote HIV and AIDS case reports till 31st of December 1997 are listed as unknown in gender and age respectively, data collection, at least by the World Health Organization in Cambodia, must be regarded as problematic. Contradictions.
In the vast scientific medical literature, over 100,000 journals published so far on HIV/AIDS, we cannot find anywhere in this vast literature the evidence that HIV causes AIDS, that AIDS is a contagious disease, or that it even sexually transmitted.
Why should HIV avoid non-drug using prostitutes? If female prostitutes who do not use drugs do not become HIV infected despite being seriously at risk of HIV infection, what is the risk of infection to the majority of Australian women who are neither drug users nor prostitutes? According to data from the National Centre in HIV Epidemiology and Clinical Research, vanishingly little. A 1989 study testing 10,217 blood samples of newborn babies found no babies and thus presumably no mothers HIV positive. If such women remain non-infected, how do their non-drug using male heterosexual partners become infected with HIV? According to Simon Wayne Hobson, a leading HIV expert from the Pasteur Institute, a virus's job is to spread. If you don't spread, you're dead. The overwhelming evidence from studies, both in homosexual men and heterosexuals, is that HIV/AIDS is not bidirectionally sexually transmitted.
AIDS is the best example of what's really scary and alarming and dangerous about our culture right now, which is that it's a culture of PR. It's a public relations phenomenon.
In the whole history of medicine, there has never been such a phenomenon. Since microbes rely on person-to-person spread for their survival, it is impossible to claim from epidemiological data that HIV/AIDS is an infectious sexually transmitted disease. Indeed, Professor Stuart Brodie has argued that physicians ignore the actual heterosexual data and instead promote the politically correct idea that everyone is at risk. Ideological knowledge about AIDS is far more likely to filter through society than scientific knowledge. The HIV Western Blot Test. The HIV Western Blot Test consists of a thin nitrocellulose strip in which are embedded proteins claimed to be unique to HIV. Each protein is labelled with a P, followed by its molecular weight in thousands. Serum is added to the strip, and if there are antibodies to a particular protein, this band will light up. The HIV Western blot is not standardised, and thus around the world different combinations of bands are considered positive. Hence, a positive test in one country is not positive in another. An African would not be positive in Australia. A person from the MAC study would not be positive anywhere in the world, including Africa, yet the HIV Western blot is considered to be highly specific and is considered synonymous with HIV infection. The diagnosis of HIV infection. The HIV antibody tests.
Well, HIV infection is diagnosed with rather now routine laboratory tests, which for which there are criteria for diagnosis established by the manufacturer, FDA.
There are two, quote, HIV antibody tests in common use, the ELISA and Western blot. The ELISA causes a colour change when a mixture of, quote, HIV proteins reacts with antibodies in serum from a patient. In the Western blot, the, quote, HIV proteins are first separated along the length of a nitrocellulose strip. This enables individual reactions to the 10 or so HIV proteins to be visualized as a series of darkened bands. The Western blot test is used to confirm repeatedly positive ELISAs because experts agree that the ELISA overreacts, that is, it is insufficiently specific.
Since '92, there is no Western blot in Great Britain because they saw it's a waste of money, you know, it's the same principle.
Prior to 1987, one HIV-specific Western blot band was considered proof of HIV infection. However, since 15 to 25% of healthy no-risk individuals have HIV-specific Western blot bands, it became necessary to redefine a positive Western blot by adding extra and selecting particular bands. Otherwise, at least 1 in every 7 people would be diagnosed as infected with HIV. On the other hand, although AIDS in Europe and the US began to decline in 1987, this trend was countered by the addition of more and more diseases, and most recently, mere laboratory abnormalities to each revision of the first 1982 CDC definition.
There's the saying that if you knew how what sausages are made of, most people would hesitate to sort of eat them because they wouldn't like what's in it. And if you knew how HIV/AIDS numbers are cooked or made up, you would use them with extreme caution.
The net effect of these changes was to maintain a correlation between HIV antibodies and AIDS amongst the risk groups, while the risk of an HIV/AIDS diagnosis outside of these groups remained slight. This was further accentuated by avoiding testing outside the risk groups. However, when such studies were performed amongst 89,547 anonymously tested blood specimens from 26 US hospital patients meticulously chosen to be at no risk of AIDS, 0.7% to 21.7% of men and 0% to 7.8% of women aged 25 to 44 years were found to be HIV Western blot positive.
When he came up with his first test, he tested 30% of the American blood donators, so let's say the general population, he tested them positive. And the industry said, no, go home, Gallo. We won't buy your test because this is going to destroy our business.
In addition, the US Consortium for Retrovirus Serology Standardization reported that 10% of 1,306 individuals at low risk for AIDS, including specimens from blood donor centres, had a positive HIV antibody test by the most stringent US Western blot criteria. Thus, the correlation of, quote, HIV antibodies with AIDS, which experts accept as the only in vivo proof that HIV causes AIDS, is not a statistic related to the natural unbridled activity of a virus, but is instead a contrivance generated by mankind. Not only does correlation never prove causation, the artificiality of this particular correlation severely compromises its scientific analysis.
That's not an epidemic. The number of cases reported went up epidemically, exponentially, because the number of tests that was done went up exponentially. How many doctors knew about HIV in 1983? 2. How many knew about it in 1985? Say 500. How many knew about it in 1986? 40,000. So that's where the curve came from. How many tests were done?
One of the most bizarre aspects of the HIV/AIDS theory is that different laboratories, institutions and countries define different sets of Western blot bands as a positive test. The global variation in interpretive criteria means that in Australia, for example, a positive test requires particular sets of 4 bands. In the USA, different sets of 2 or 3 suffice, which may or may not include the bands required in Australia. In Africa, only 1 designated set of 2 is required. Put simply, this means that the same person tested in 3 cities on the same day may or may not be HIV infected. If the diagnosis of HIV infection were a poker game, a flush would require 5 cards the same suit in one country, but only 1 or 2 elsewhere. A virus cannot behave in this manner, but according to the HIV test, which is claimed to have a specificity of 99.999%, it does. As incomprehensible as this appears, further difficulties remain. For example, an Australian tested in Australia with 1 or 2 HIV-specific bands would not be reported as HIV infected. Clearly, however, there must be a reason why an uninfected individual, such as a healthy blood donor or military recruit, can possess even one HIV-specific band. According to the experts, these bands are caused by cross-reacting, that is, false non-HIV antibodies which react with the HIV proteins. Thus, it is axiomatic that an antibody which reacts with a particular protein is not necessarily an antibody which the immune system has generated specifically in response to that protein.
Since a false positive looks like a true positive, how can you ever distinguish whether it's truly a positive or a negative?
Well, that's a great question. It's going to be very hard to determine a false positive.
The Australian National HIV Reference Laboratory, NRL, concedes that false reactivity may be to one or more HIV protein bands and is common. 20 to 25% of anti-HIV negative blood donors will exhibit one or more bands on a Western blot. However, Aliopoulos argues that if non-HIV antibodies cause one or more protein bands, then why are they not able to cause 4 or 5 or all 10? On what basis do experts assert which antibodies are false and which are true? Or how do the same 3 bands caused by false non-HIV antibodies become true when accompanied by 1 extra? On what basis do experts assert that there are true HIV antibodies? If the Australian traveller were to be tested in the USA, where 2 or 3 bands are sufficient to diagnose HIV infection, are his antibodies false in Australia but true as his aeroplane touches down in Los Angeles? In 1994, Dr. Valinda Turner wrote to the Medical Journal of Australia, seeking justification of both the Australian criteria for a positive Western blot test and the global variability. The response by Dr. Elizabeth Dax of the NRL did not answer either question, and subsequently correspondents failed to pass the editorial staff at the same journal. When the same questions were later put via the offices of Senator Chris Ellison, the first question was again unanswered, and the widely different criteria between Australia and Africa were justified on the basis that in Africa, comparatively false reactivity is far less common than in Australia, so that interpretation criteria to define true positivity may be less strict. However, no scientist can make such a claim without data.
Because of the different criteria that apply in different countries, you can test HIV positive in one country and be given an AIDS diagnosis as a result of that, whereas in another country you won't test HIV positive and you won't be given an AIDS diagnosis.
It's ludicrous that you can be positive in one country and not positive in another.
All antibody tests are subject to the vagaries of cross-reactions, and the only way to calculate the incidences of true and false antibodies is to scrutinise reactions against what the test is purportedly meant to measure, that is, against HIV itself.
Nobody can find free infectious HIV virus in a human being. That is why they have to resort to looking for antibodies to HIV in a person. That is one of the biggest flaws in the HIV hypothesis.
HIV isolation is the only gold standard by which the specificity of the antibodies can be determined, and this must be evaluated before the test is introduced into clinical practice. However, despite the Western blot test being in widespread use and a stalwart of HIV testing, these data have never been reported by the NRL or any other laboratory. Even without such evidence, since A, the NRL concedes that cross-reacting antibodies cause misleading reactions in the Western blot in 1/4 of healthy Australians, and B, unlike Australians, Africans, similar to the AIDS risk groups, are exposed to a multitude of infectious agents, producing myriad antibodies. False reactivity will be much higher in Africa, where the Western blot criteria should be the most stringent. If, quote, HIV antibodies indeed prove that 1/3 of heterosexual adults in certain Central and Eastern African countries are infected with HIV, life in these countries must be one endless orgy. In 1999, it was reported that 35% of patients with primary biliary cirrhosis 39% of patients with other biliary disorders, 29% of those with lupus, 60% of patients with hepatitis B, 35% with hepatitis C, all non-HIV, non-AIDS diseases have antibodies to the, quote, HIV P24 core protein. Until 1990, an unknown number of the 4,954 homosexual men in the MAX study were diagnosed HIV infected on the basis of an antibody to the HIV-specific P24 protein that is with one Western blot band. Why do not all similar tests prove infection with HIV? Why are gay men with a single P24 band infected with a deadly virus, while biliary and liver disease patients with the same band are not? Why were the criteria for diagnosing HIV infection set less rigorously for homosexual men and Africans? And if HIV antibodies are specific and HIV infection is for life, why do reformed drug addicts leading healthy lives lose their HIV antibodies?
And this time my results come back marked from the lab indeterminate. I'm faced with the decision, do I want to wait 6 weeks to test again or do it right away? I opted for right away. My results that time come back positive. Took it again, came back negative. I took it again, positive.
What happens if you're positive on one criteria but negative on another manufacturer's criteria? How do you decide who's infected and who's not?
You will use the most sensitive criterion.
Although all HIV experts accept cross-reactivity in HIV antibody testing, in 1993 the New South Wales Department of Health interpreted the discovery of, quote, HIV antibodies in 4 women as compelling evidence for transmission of HIV from a homosexual man during the course of minor office surgery in 1989. However, there was no proof that the man was HIV infected at the time of surgery, or that any of the 4 women were operated on after the man. This report remains the only one of its kind in the world, and it immediately led to the establishment of a special committee of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, which wrote to all college fellows, inviting submissions upon the matter. But rather than seizing upon the rarity of the event and following advice, urging a formal scientific inquiry into whether, quote, HIV antibodies are caused by infection with a retrovirus, the college accepted these data as proof of cross-infection, but concluded the mode of transmission is unknown.
These tests claim to be HIV tests. I'm going to read from a section that says limitations of the tests. The specificity of the Reveal Rapid HIV antibody test for blood specimens in low-risk populations has not been evaluated. They don't know, in their terms even, how well this test is going to work in people they don't want it to work in, low risk. We don't think you're at risk.
Unlike HIV/AIDS experts who claim the specificity of the HIV antibody test is 99.999%, one manufacturer of HIV antibody test states in the package insert, at present there is no recognised standard for establishing the presence or absence of HIV-1 antibody in human blood. Therefore, sensitivity was computed on the clinical diagnosis of AIDS and specificity based on random, healthy blood donors. The latter were chosen as de facto non-HIV infected for the purposes of determining how many tests are false positives. However, by this reasoning, since the majority of HIV positive individuals are healthy, they cannot be infected. Thus, the WHO predictions of a global pandemic are patently untrue.
If we were talking about reality, the reality is that AIDS is over.
The Yin and Yang of HIV by Dr. Valinda Turner and Andrew McIntyre. Part 3. When put to the test, conventional HIV/AIDS theory is at odds with the clinical evidence. Is purified HIV no more than a tangle of cellular debris? Discovery consists of seeing what everyone has seen and thinking what nobody has thought.
If one goes through all the HIV literature which exists to date, I think one will find it bold and incredible to still believe that there is proof for the existence of HIV. When a particle looks like a retrovirus, you have to isolate it, then put it in another culture, show that the cells in the secondary culture produce particles exactly like the particles from which they originated. That the two particles from the two cultures are exactly the same can be shown only by determining their constituent proteins and RNA. So isolation is extremely important to prove that a particle is a retrovirus.
The diagnosis of HIV infection. What proof is there for the existence of HIV? Scientific evidence for the existence of a retrovirus must be consistent with the definition of a retrovirus as a particular kind of replicating microscopic particle. Thus, researchers must demonstrate the correct size, shape, and construction of particles, that these particles have been purified and analysed and contain RNA as well as an enzyme, reverse transcriptase, that makes DNA from RNA, and that the particles are infectious. That is, when pure particles are introduced into fresh cell cultures, identical progeny appear. The latter necessitates a second round of purification and analysis. Indeed, although this method is entirely logical and was deemed essential at a meeting held at the Pasteur Institute in 1973, it has been ignored by all HIV researchers.
So Montagnier claimed to prove that he had particles, he had proteins which are not present in any other retrovirus. He purified the virus. But he did not publish any electron micrographs of the purified material to prove, you seeing is believing. And they claimed that they had purified material, but there were no electron micrographs. And this is one of the conditions where Barré-Sinoussi and Jean-Claude Charmaine put it in 1973. You must have picture of the purified virus and show that the material contains nothing else but particles with the same physical characteristics. But no such pictures were published.
Although there are electron microscope photographs from unpurified cell cultures of particles purported to be HIV particles, it was not until March 1997 that electron micrographs of purified HIV were published. Yet, such data is the first, most essential step in attempts to prove particles are a virus, and for subsequent extraction of constituents for analysis and use as diagnostic reagents. These long-awaited micrographs reveal purified HIV to be a tangle of cellular debris. Scattered amongst this are scant particles which, without evidence, the authors claim are the HIV particles and which co-purify with the cellular material.
I'm absolutely dismayed to find out that for about 15 years, the essential control of electron microscopy was neglected, completely neglected. And it's only very recently, about 2 years ago, that 2 papers came out in which finally electron microscopy was used to verify the presence of virus particles in samples which were for all these 15 years regarded as pure virus. And to my greatest dismay, these pictures were showing practically nothing else but cell debris.
Close examination of these particles, as well as other evidence in the papers, show they are too large, wrongly shaped, have too high a mass, and are devoid of knobs that HIV experts unanimously assert are absolutely essential for the HIV particle to cause infection. It is from this material that HIV/AIDS experts and biotechnology companies obtain proteins and RNA to use in tests to pronounce humans infected with a unique exogenous AIDS-causing microbe. On 17th of July 1997, the French investigative television journalist Jamel Tahi interviewed Professor Luc Montagnier on camera at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. Montagnier was asked, "Why do the electron micrograph photographs published by you come from the culture and not the purification?" His reply was, "There was so little production of virus it was impossible to see what might be in a concentrate of the virus from the gradient. There was not enough virus to do that. Of course one looked for it. One looked for it in the tissues at the start. Likewise the biopsy. We saw some particles, but they did not have the morphology typical of retroviruses.
It was startling that Professor Montagnier decided to acknowledge in his interview with Jamel Kahi in Continuum that as far back as 1983, his team were not able to purify anything that you might call HIV, despite what he termed a Roman effort.
Questioned about the Gallo group, Montagnier replied, "Gallo? I don't know if he really purified. I don't believe so. This should have been both the beginning and the end of HIV." Retrovirus-like particles are virtually ubiquitous in biological material, including, for example, cell cultures, and the majority, if not all, human placentas.
In fact, the third problem with the virus, with the particle, is that they use umbilical culture lymphocytes, which originate from placenta. In placenta, it was known in the 70s that they release virus-like particle and they have reverse transcriptase activity. So find them in this culture is no proof that they originated from Montagnier's patient.
However, as Gallo confirms, the majority of retrovirus-like particles are not retroviruses because they do not replicate. The HIV particle has been classified into 2 subfamilies and 3 genera of retroviruses. This is analogous to describing a new species of mammal as a human, a gorilla, and an orangutan. Besides the HIV particle, cell cultures contain other particles of numerous morphologies, whose origin and role are unknown. A long and detailed study from Harvard revealed the identical HIV particle in 18 out of 20, 90% of AIDS-related lymph node enlargements, but also in 13 out of 15, 88% of non-AIDS related enlargements. HIV experts claim to detect and even isolate HIV merely by demonstrating reverse transcription in cultures. However, although a property of retroviruses, reverse transcription is not, as many HIV/AIDS experts claim, unique to retroviruses or even viruses. Well before the AIDS era, Gallo himself showed that chemically stimulated normal lymphocytes possess this function.
The only way to say that the existence of reverse transcriptase or the detection of reverse transcriptase activity proves the retrovirus was there is only if reverse transcription was specific to retroviruses, which is not the case. In fact, today nearly everybody accepts that reverse transcription or reverse transcriptase activity is non-specific to retroviruses.
The HIV proteins and antibodies. Although both Montagnier and Gallo have never published electron micrographs to prove the presence of retrovirus-like particles in their pure virus, and Montagnier now concedes there weren't any, both groups and all others since claim such material as pure HIV. This claim is based on the fact that such material contains proteins which react with antibodies present in AIDS patients. However, such reasoning is untenable. Imagine a scientist who mixes 2 solutions together, obtains a precipitate, and then proclaims the identity and source of several reactants. One does not need a degree in chemistry to realize this is an impossibility. Nonetheless, because cultures and antibodies derived from AIDS patients react together, the proteins are declared to belong to HIV and the antibodies, the HIV-specific antibodies.
Nobody can find free infectious HIV virus in a human being. That is why they have to resort to looking for antibodies to HIV in a person. That is one of the biggest flaws in the HIV hypothesis.
In fact, Gallo admits that for him, an antibody test is the quintessence of HIV isolation. During an interview at the 1998 Geneva AIDS conference, he admitted,
"Sometimes we had Western blot positive where we couldn't isolate the virus. So we got worried and felt that we're getting false positives sometimes, so we added the Western blot." So it was an experimental tool when we added it, and for us it worked well because we could isolate the virus, so we did.
Actually, in 1984, Gallo's false positives sometimes were antibodies in 88% of AIDS patients, but virus isolated in 36% of AIDS patients. Gallo solved the twin dilemmas of the missing virus and gross non-specificity of the HIV antibodies by making the Western blot antibody test an integral part of virus isolation. However, an antibody test is not isolation of a virus. HIV proteins can only be defined by extracting them from particles purified and proven to be a unique retrovirus. Such material has never been shown to exist, and such extraction never reported. Notwithstanding, since the mid-1980s, HIV researchers claim that a culture which reacts with a monoclonal antibody to one of the HIV proteins, the P24 protein, is proof of isolation of HIV. Since to isolate a virus is to obtain infectious particles separate from everything else, it is particularly difficult to see how so many scientists persevere in referring to a chemical reaction in this manner.
Now, the word isolation means to obtain something or to place something apart or to obtain a substance separate from everything else. Apparently, Montagnier by isolation did not mean this, but something totally different.
The origin of the HIV proteins. According to Aliopoulos and her colleagues, all data presented to date are consistent with the HIV proteins being cellular. Using HIV antibodies as probes, HIV proteins have been identified in the tissues of persistently HIV-negative, healthy individuals, including in blood platelet and skin cells, thymus, tonsil and brain. As a mark of the bewildering status of the HIV theory, while HIV proteins could not be found in the placentas of 75 HIV-positive pregnant women, they could be found in the placentas of 25 healthy HIV-negative women.
If there is such a thing as an AIDS-causing retrovirus, then its unique body parts, that is its proteins, should only be found in HIV-positive individuals and individuals who have AIDS. But this is not the case. All the principal HIV proteins have been found in all manner of cells from healthy human beings who are HIV negative.
The HIV genome. As is the case with HIV proteins, the RNA purported to be the HIV genome has not been obtained from particles purified and proven infectious, but from the conglomerate material described above. Molecular biologists have produced possibly more information about the HIV genome than any other object in the universe. Nonetheless, there are no reports of even one individual possessing a complete, full-length HIV genome, and there is no agreement as to how many genes HIV possesses. Opinions have varied from 4 through to 8, 9 or 10. Human DNA and chimpanzee DNA differ by less than 2%, but variation in the composition of the HIV genome measures between 3% and 40%.
We have studied retroviruses, but HIV in particular has never been clearly defined in terms of its genetic structure and its molecular structure. And what I mean by that is that you can try to determine the genetic sequence of HIV from one person and compare it to another person, or even different viruses in the same person's body, and you'll find that there are huge variations in their genetic sequences. And now we're starting to talk about different strains and mutations and all this stuff. What that really means is that nobody's really sure exactly what HIV is, what the exact genetic sequence is.
Given that the DNA sequence determines the composition of a virus's proteins, and the latter, the physical, biochemical, and biological properties of a virus, how is it possible for such variation to represent one and the same agent? For example, how is it possible that HIV can induce the same antibodies, which can be recognized in a universal antibody test containing the identical proteins? Since, as the molecular biologist Duesberg reminds us, there is a range, a small range, in which you can mutate around without too much penalty, but as soon as you exceed it, you are gone and you are not HIV any longer, or a human any longer. Then you are either dead or you are a monkey, or what have you. It is evident that whatever the HIV DNA genome represents, it cannot be a virus. If there exists certain RNA which is unique to a retrovirus HIV, then finding such RNA should prove infection. However, the concordance between antibody and genetic tests varies between 40% to 100%, and HIV RNA can be found in individuals not infected with HIV. In responding to this scientific dilemma, the HIV experts have proclaimed that plasma viral load, HIV RNA assays are designed for monitoring the effectiveness of antiretroviral therapies and for measuring the quantity of virus in patients with confirmed HIV infection, not for the diagnosis of HIV infection. Their performance in patients who are not infected with HIV is unknown, and their use leads to misdiagnosis of HIV infection. One manufacturer of PCR states that the AmpliCore HIV-1 monitor test is not intended to be used as a screening test for HIV or as a diagnostic test to confirm the presence of HIV infection.
And he was using Kerr-Miley's PCR technique, which is a multiplication technique, not a quantification technique, by the way, and multiply molecules into its millions and equal those molecules with the virus, right? Absolutely ridiculous. Even more, as those sequences he's going to multiply and equal them with the virus, that's the viral load, are present in everybody. It's just a way to save face for the whole AIDS industry, because more and more people are aware that this could not be, you know, because inside the AIDS scene there are a lot of critical medical doctors, but they saw such a lot of contradiction, and it was discussed on conferences. So there was high noon for a new medal and a new test where the pharmaceutical companies could make a great business out of it.
These being the case, the specificity of plasma viral load is unknown, and it is difficult, if not impossible, to claim that HIV RNA is the unique constituent of a specific retrovirus. How can one even consider using such tests to monitor or diagnose a supposedly deadly virus when the viral load obtained varies between 0 and 1 million copies on the same sample, depending on which technique or strain of HIV is involved? Lessons from the past. The evidence for the existence of Gallo's first human retrovirus, HL23V, was much stronger than for HIV. However, in 1980, the antibodies to the HL23V proteins were shown to occur following a large variety of common non-infectious factors, and in far more humans than could ever have developed leukemia. Thus, from signifying that an infectious mode of transmission of leukemia remains a real possibility in humans, and infection with an oncovirus retrovirus may be extremely widespread, the first human retrovirus abruptly disappeared from the annals of science. At present, no one, not even Gallo, believes it existed. However, had it not been for the efforts of the two research groups at the National Cancer Institute and Sloan Kettering, there was the distinct possibility that by now the world would be facing a pandemic of HL23V disease. In the AIDS era, experts recognise that antibodies to the HIV-specific proteins occur where there is no HIV, and in many more individuals than will ever develop AIDS. On what basis, then, does HIV still exist?
Every single prediction of the HIV theory has failed.
The dissident case, politics and public health policy.
It was first suggested that a retrovirus, HIV, was, and I quote, the probable cause of AIDS at a US government press conference in 1984. Since then, it's been generally accepted that AIDS is an infectious disease transmitted through blood and sex. If, however, as these scientists maintain, AIDS is not an infectious, sexually transmitted disease, then AIDS research has been wrongly directed for 15 years.
The failures of the past 15 years are fairly and squarely affixed to the 5 Montagnier and Gallo 1983-1984 science papers. That the titles of 3 of these papers contain the word isolation, and yet no evidence was presented, must stand as a memorial to the demise of editorial integrity. The dissident cases that HIV does not exist, Aliopolis, or if it does exist, it does not cause AIDS, Aliopolis and Duisberg, ultimately imply there will be devastating outcomes in terms of scientific credibility, including the failure of peer review, the demise of reputations of many experts and non-experts, the challenge to citizens' trust in governmental, scientific and medical leaders, as well as an uncertain period for the medical profession as a whole. Weaving a just resolution through this maze of socio-medico-legal bedlam will require the utmost tenacity from political leaders. Perhaps there are already signs of quiet beginnings, with the Americans' 1994 return of the discovery of HIV to the French, followed by Montagnier's admissions in his 1997 interview. Exceptionalism. Over and above all the uncertainties surrounding the HIV/AIDS debate, AIDS science medicine must stand as the most remarkable case of exceptionalism in history. The funding it attracts far outstrips that justified by its prevalence and economic impact. For example, over the past 17 years, Australia has a cumulative total of 7,766 AIDS cases, including 5,575 deaths. The big spenders are, in order, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Germany and Italy. Their combined annual HIV/AIDS research budget amounts to US $1.8 billion for a cumulative total of 761,572 AIDS patients, many of whom are dead. Of an additional US $20 million spent by the European Union in 1994 to 1998, most money goes to support travel and meeting costs rather than laboratory research.
There is a most urgent need to redirect research funding. Funds should go to laboratories working on other ideas totally independent from HIV and no longer restricted to laboratories working on a hypothesis which has never been proven.
While thousands of dollars per patient are spent on HIV/AIDS research, only a few dollars are spent on heart disease, cancer, mental illness, suicide prevention or road trauma. The funding paradox reaches epidemic, almost farcical proportions in developing countries, where Western AIDS workers spend their days dispensing advice and condoms to a population dying for want of pure water, adequate sanitation and nutrition, and antibacterial, antitubercular and anti-malarial medicines. In a word, dying of poverty.
Why have we done nothing for African people, just like give them clean water so they don't die in infancy of diarrheal disease and stuff like this? All we care about is HIV/AIDS. Well, question. Well, there's money in it. There has to be, other dynamic working to lead public interest to the African situation and ignore clean water, sanitation, malaria. I mean, things that kill people.
In 2000, the annual cost of anti-HIV drugs for one person is about US $15,000. Greater than the entire health budget for many a third world village. With 650,000 to 900,000 HIV-positive patients in the US as of July 1996, it would take US $10 billion to pay for drugs alone. Without HIV, AIDS patients and specialist AIDS units and their employees can rationally be absorbed into the existing infrastructure of clinics and hospitals. The pursuit of expensive drugs designed to kill HIV will be irrelevant, as will be the work of the legions of HIV researchers. The same applies to AIDS councils, the armies of AIDS educators, fundraisers, volunteers and AIDS organisations. In the US alone, there are 93,000 of the latter, one for every 4 persons ever diagnosed with AIDS.
And picking up the torch as the campaign chairman of the American Foundation for AIDS Research.
Use red? Nobody's dead.
We'll have red products, we'll have red phones.
Last year we raised over $1 million, we were very happy, and now it's grown immeasurably over the last year.
Members of the public often notice the celebrities who have suddenly and inexplicably become experts on public health. We have turned these kinds of stars into authorities on things way beyond their own training and their own knowledge.
Clear thinking. Homo sapiens, thinking man, was not named in vain. An honourable society provides unfettered information and encourages its members to make rational choices. Epidemiology shows that the development of a positive HIV antibody test in AIDS is not so much related to a given sexual practice, but rather to the frequency of passive anal intercourse in both men and women. It follows that AIDS is not a disease of sexual orientation, and as far as women are concerned, it is prudent to note that in absolute terms, innumerably more women than men engage in anal intercourse. Even so, it is not the act itself, but the very high frequency of the act which is pathogenic. As serious as public reaction to an ill-conceived retrovirus may prove, it will not be anywhere as serious as the legal backlash. There are countless individuals alive who believe they are infected with a deadly microbe, and many of them are currently treated with potentially toxic drugs with no proven benefit. They avoid intimacy, avoid having children, and sometimes avoid even casual contact with others. It would take a flotilla of poet laureates to voice the collective pain and suffering engendered by such a mistake. It would take an army of mathematically gifted lawyers to quantify, and the nation's coffers to compensate, those whose lives have been ruined by what Neville Hodgkinson has called the greatest scientific blunder of the 20th century.
It wasn't a plot, it wasn't even greed or anything like that. It was a mistake in certain circumstances that happened, but the failure has been that science failed to correct that error.
This is not to forget patients and relatives who have died at their own hands. In 1987, former US Senator Lawton Chiles of Florida told an AIDS conference of a tragic case where 22 blood donors were informed they were HIV infected on the basis of an ELISA test. 7 donors then committed suicide. In June 1998, the Swiss AIDS analyst Michael Baumgartner persuaded United Nations officials to include a dissident session at the 12th International AIDS Conference held in Geneva. Speakers include Hugh Christie, editor of Continuum magazine, AIDS analyst and documentary filmmaker Joan Shenton, epidemiologist Professor Gordon Stewart, retrovirologist and electron microscopist Professor Etienne de Haven, virologist Dr. Stefan Lenker, and by satellite Eleni Aliopoulos and her group from the Royal Perth Hospital. In the audience were observers from the Pasteur Institute and the US National Institutes for Health. The topic of the session was a scientific critique of the HIV antibody tests and the evidence for the existence of HIV. At the official press conference held after the meeting, Professor Bernard Herschel, chairman of the organising committee, accused the speakers of using outdated and untrustworthy scientific data. However, it was this outdated data, that of Montagnier and Gallo, that led to the 1984 proclamation that HIV is the cause of AIDS. That considered untrustworthy is the HIV experts' own data. Notwithstanding these and many other challenges to the current dogma, HIV/AIDS experts are not in the least disquieted by sceptical patients, relatives or scientists, and inveigh heavily against inquisitive journalists alleging great harm to public health. Thus it appears that the only hope for an immediate resolution of this troubled issue is to have lawyers appearing for plaintiffs who desire judgments that they are or are not infected with an AIDS-causing virus. However, even if an examination of HIV science is destined to be scrutinised by courts of law, at present one must be realistic that in the short term the status quo is extremely unlikely to change. Perhaps a disinterested observer could be forgiven for concluding that although we are now well into the 18th year of the AIDS era and have spent many billions of dollars on treatments and research, the words of Dr. Peter Duesberg continue to taunt us. By any measure, the war on AIDS has been a colossal failure. Our leading scientists and policymakers cannot demonstrate that their efforts have saved a single life.
At least they should open up the field to people with other theories, because their own has proven to be such a resounding failure.
Perhaps the words of Aliopoulos' group are of even greater portent. The single most important obstacle in finding the explanation for AIDS is the belief in HIV.
What is called AIDS is made up of 29 diseases, all of which existed long before the AIDS eras. These diseases involve fungal, mycobacterial, and other infection, producing antibodies which could react with the so-called HIV protein.
In his book, Dancing Naked in the Minefield, Dr. Kari Mullis writes, "Years from now, people will find our acceptance of the HIV theory of AIDS as silly as we find those who excommunicated Galileo. Indeed, it was Galileo who counselled, in science, the authority embodied in the opinion of thousands is not worth a spark of reason on one man." Perhaps we should all pause, look around, and then take a long look back. Postscript. Unlike many scientific publications, the Yin and Yang essay series, which was published in 1999, has aged extremely well. However, there has of course been developments over the past 23 years. One has been the claim that modern antiretroviral therapies are working well, and this proves that HIV does exist and does cause AIDS. These claims, and others, have been dealt with in several publications by the Perth Group. I'll put links in the video description and encourage anyone wanting to take a deeper dive into the arguments to read these papers.
AIDS has both sexes running scared. Research studies now project that 1 in 5, listen to me, hard to believe, 1 in 5 heterosexuals could be dead from AIDS at the end of the next 3 years. That's by 1990.
So that we don't lose touch, please find me at drzambailey.com and sign up for my free newsletter.